And welcome back to Restaurant Prank Podcast with me, your host, Jack Gore. So this week, I'm joined by Anneliese Hodge, who's joining us from down in Plymouth, who's going to be telling us about her work investigating sunscreens. So first of all, Anneliese, welcome. And you
Thank
start by telling us, lovely to have you. So start by telling us a little bit about what you're up to, your background, and what it is that you do day to day.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me. So I am a PhD student at the University of Plymouth and Plymouth Marine Laboratory. My background, I did an undergraduate degree in environmental science, and then I went on to do a Master's of Research degree in marine biology. And here I am now doing my PhD. And I actually look at the effects of sunscreens and sunscreen chemicals on the marine environment. So I looked at this in my Master's of Research degree, and my PhD sort of follows on from that study. So I'm looking at the effect of certain chemicals within sunscreen formulations and the effect that it can have on the biological effects that it can have on marine organisms in temperate climates. So in our environments here in the UK.
Fantastic. And when did you or your colleagues or others begin to discover that there are these issues linking sort of marine degradation environments and sunscreens?
So it's a relatively new emerging area of research, and sort of my interest originally sparked in it just because I was wondering myself, like, what is this that I'm wearing having an effect on when I go surfing and that sort of thing? How is that impacting the marine environment? Because I don't know about you, but sometimes you can sort of see on a busy day at the beach, like a slick sort of over the water, an oily slick. And I sort of thought to myself, something's not really quite right there. Like, what this is going to be having some sort of effect. And from that, that's sort of where my idea posed for my master's degree. And I actually approached both institutions and said, look, would you guys be interested in sort of collaborating on a project, investigating this a little bit further? So this wasn't something that had necessarily been touched on before by the university or PML. So we then started learning from my master's work that actually, no, there is an effect on some organisms in temperate climates. And now that's sort of where we're leading it with my PhD to see what level of effect can it be having. But focusing on other countries as well, so in sort of tropical climates, coral reef environments, there has been a lot more work sort of years prior. And that's sort of what's led on now to other countries sort of thinking, well, actually, if there's an effect there, then is there an effect in our country as well, and in our environments too? So originally, a lot of this work sort of stems looking into aquatic environments more generally, so freshwater environments, how these compounds get into river systems and that sort of thing. And then from there, it slowly stemmed into the effects that it can have on the marine environment.
And what are some of these effects that you observed?
So generally effects, that's in tropical climates, for example, we're starting to see coral bleaching being linked to sunscreens. And we're also sort of seeing DNA damage in some organisms. We're sort of seeing mortality and a lack of mobility in some species as well. And this is at sort of environmentally relevant concentrations in laboratory studies, which we've then been able to sort of transcend into what is actually happening in the real environment. In my research myself, I've been looking, in my master's research looked at macroalgae, so temperate marine macroalgae, and we sort of compared the effects of different UV filters. So UV filters are ultraviolet filters that are added to sunscreens to essentially block or absorb the UV lights to stop it from reaching our skin. And these compounds are what I use to sort of expose the seaweeds to see if it would have an impact on their photosynthetic efficiency. So did it inhibit their photosynthesis? Did it inhibit their growth? Or I also wanted to understand if it affected some gases that seaweeds often release, volatile organic compounds, which are used as like an indicator of their overall level of stress that they're under. And from my master's work, we actually found that, yes, certain compounds can inhibit photosynthesis within macroalgae, and they could also influence the volatile organic compound concentrations. So now during my PhD studies, we're looking into a little bit more detail at a broader range of species. So at the moment, I'm looking at phytoplankton, and then we're going to be moving on to looking at some zooplankton and then also some marine mussels. But so far, we found that environmentally relevant concentrations of certain UV filters can completely inhibit growth and can lead to mortality within less than 24 hours. So we're getting some quite significant and good results, but equally there's definitely a lot more room for us to understand more about these compounds.
So more specifically, what are these compounds, and are they crucial to the actual sunscreening process?
Yeah, so as I said, in sunscreens, we get UV filters, and UV filters can be either organic or inorganic compounds. So your inorganic compounds are what we call essentially chemical-based filters. So they will be things like oxybenzone and octocrylene, avobenzone. They're man-made chemicals. And they actually sort of absorb the sun's radiation. Whereas we also have inorganic UV filters, and these are things like zinc oxide and titanium dioxide, and these essentially reflect or scatter the sun's UV radiation. And there can be a bit of a difference. Research so far by other researchers as well have sort of been comparing the effects of these two types of compounds. So essentially what we're trying to discover now is whether a chemical like oxybenzone has the same or different effect than a UV filter like titanium dioxide. The majority of your sort of commercial-based sunscreens, so what you would find just in the supermarket, would generally contain organic UV filters, so things like oxybenzone and octocrylene. If you went to sort of a health supermarket or someone like Holland & Barrett, for example, they would generally sell more of your inorganic sunscreens. So yeah, at the moment, it's just about trying to understand which UV filters are better and perhaps whether there's any sort of potential to be able to incorporate these better UV filters and swap them out instead to have less of an impact on the marine environment.
But generally speaking, you mentioned, of course, health stores, Holland & Barrett, and then sort of more commercial. Without, of course, naming any names, getting ourselves in trouble, are the kind of the general use sunscreens that people would see or be familiar with, do they pretty much all use these sort of more dangerous compounds?
Yes, unfortunately so. So the organic UV filters are much more widely used globally. And yeah, they're a lot cheaper to produce. So obviously it works in their favor to be able to use those compounds, but equally they do the job. You know, they do protect us from the sun's UV rays. And equally, it's an important balance to be able to make sure that these sunscreens still contain UV filters in them that protect us, whilst also making sure that they are, you know, safe for the marine environment too.
Are they also, perhaps this is a separate issue, but are they also safe for people to use totally, or is that a little bit unknown? Or
So my sort of research hasn't looked into the effects that it can
sure,
have on humans, but there are some studies to suggest that some of these compounds on their own can have some negative effects on humans. But I wouldn't want to sort of necessarily get into that too much or speculate from without having obviously a professional background in that particular area.
of course, of course, of course. Okay, so in terms of obviously the work you're conducting is still very much ongoing. How could things be pushed in a more sort of healthier direction, a more sort of environmentally friendly direction? So is it just a case of promoting the likes of these sunscreens that Holland Barrett use? Are there certain companies that you're aware of, or sort of new innovations that we could be looking to? How do you think things could be pushed forward in your field to really sort of get things off the ground and sort of raise awareness?
Yeah, I think that raise awareness part of it is definitely something that is one of the most important things. I think at the moment, a lot of people don't necessarily know that there's a difference between different sunscreens, or even the fact that they could be having a potential effect on the marine environment. So I think just that public awareness in itself could make people sort of either think twice or change their sort of product preferences and that sort of thing. But equally, looking at it from more of a regulatory perspective, I think there needs to be much more regulation over the types of compounds that can be used in sunscreens. In some countries, or states, I should say, like Hawaii, they've actually banned a couple of UV filters, such as oxybenzone and octocrylene, which are two organic UV filters because of their known impact on coral reefs. So they basically said, even to tourists as well, like, you cannot bring in sunscreens to our state that contain these ingredients. And also, they're not allowed to produce within Hawaii sunscreens containing those ingredients either. So I think it would be really impactful if a lot more places start to implement a little bit more of a regulatory approach to some of these compounds. Currently here in the UK and also elsewhere in the EU, there is very little regulation over the types of compounds that can be used in sunscreens. So at the moment, it's more of just like a percentage of sort of the overall product mass of how much UV filter is allowed in the product itself, rather than there being so much of a regulatory approach to what's actually the UV filter is in that product, if that makes sense. So yeah, I think there should be a good balance between public awareness and also regulatory situations, for sure.
Sorry, and just to reiterate a little bit, so what you're really saying there is the fact that there just isn't that widely known an issue, and it just really needs to be pushed. And it sounds like you're really at the forefront of actually something quite important stuff, given how, the sun's out now, and obviously you're down in Devon, and summer's coming, and we'd like to go to the beach and stuff. It's obviously quite a massive issue. So in terms of scaling, and you mentioned sort of bleaching or sort of issues for various parts of the world. So more specifically in the UK, I'm not quite sure it's which beach you've been to or what have you, but so to put it in sort of more of a UK British person's perspective, so they're going down to Cornwall, Devon, certainly not where I live, but never mind. But what type of effects would they be having? So they put on their sunscreen, it's of course washed off. As we mentioned, you see it like almost like petrol kind of looking. So it's then going into the marine environment, and it's essentially so species that it's affecting here in the UK are things such as, could you give me a bit of a run through?
Yeah, sure. So with that sort of thing, we're looking a lot at the intertidal range. So because we're talking about our coastal environments, we're talking a lot more about sort of macroalgae, microalgae, so your seaweeds, but also things like filter feeders, so mussels, oysters, those sorts of species. You've also got different sea snails and that sort of thing that could be impacted, but also looking at a bigger scale, we've also got it's also been sort of suggested that UV filters can be passed through the food chain and could eventually impact fish. So for example, if the microalgae becomes contaminated or the macroalgae becomes contaminated, then that gets eaten by a fish species, for example. That UV filter that is being contaminated in the microalgae can then be passed on to that fish. So then they've got that inside them too. So there's certainly that sort of bio accumulation sort of side of the research to sort of understand whether and to the extent to which these compounds can bioaccumulate. So going back to the fish, there's been some studies to suggest that some of these compounds can actually result in fish gender shift. So female species can actually then turn into male species. Some laboratory studies have shown that. So there's definitely sort of some major effects going on here that we need to definitely research a lot more to truly understand the environmental fate of these compounds.
That's really fascinating. And of course, I don't want to get back into the territory of is this harmful to humans, but surely we were talking about sunscreen through the skin, but surely if it's going through the food chain, potentially there could be some scope for some damage. Brilliant. Okay. Well, not brilliant. That's terrible. But what I mean is brilliant. I now know so much more about this because really, as I say, it's fascinating topic. And is there anything you'd like to add? How could you see things hopefully progressing in the next 5 to 10 years? What would you like to see? What would be some of the new barriers your research?
So I think there also needs to be a little bit more awareness about the fact that sunscreen and the pollution that we get in the marine environment from sunscreens isn't just from direct release. So it's not just from us wearing our sunscreen and then going in the sea and going for a swim or going for a paddle and that sort of thing. There's many other ways that these UV filter compounds can enter the marine environment. So for example, if you've been wearing sunscreen in your garden and you go and have a shower, all of that's then being rinsed off and will be then go to the wastewater treatment plant. However, unfortunately, a lot of these compounds do not get removed at the wastewater treatment stage. So when that effluent then gets released by the wastewater companies, that will then enter our rivers and then have an impact in the river systems as well as then obviously eventually heading out into the sea. So there's many different ways that these compounds can get into the marine environment and or the aquatic environment in general. And there also needs to be sort of an understanding that it's not just people who go to the coast that, you know, it can influence. It's also sort of anybody who uses sunscreen or uses products that contain UV filters. So I think looking into the future, it would be great if we could sort of figure out a way of being able to actually remove some of these compounds from the wastewater before we discharge, to sort of alleviate it at source. But equally, as I said, education about the idea that sunscreens can have an effect on the marine environment is definitely something that is highly valuable. But yeah, I think this is definitely going to be an area of research that will continuously grow, and hopefully we'll be able to look at some sort of regulatory approaches and that sort of thing to prevent these compounds from having harmful effects in the marine environment.
And finally, Annelise, for anyone who wants to get in touch with you, sort of support, follow your work, where can they find you?
Sure. So if you go onto the PML page, I've got a profile on there and it's got all of my details. I've got a blog, I've got LinkedIn, I've also got Instagram, which is the Marine Post. But yeah, LinkedIn is probably a super quick and easy way of finding me. Just type in Anneliese Hodge and I'll be there. But yeah, so please do feel free to get in touch.
Annelise, thank you so much for your time. That was really informative. Thank you.
Thank you so much.